As you know, every January we have a Back in the Saddle safety event, as well as a Day of Remembrance. This year, in memory of the 15th anniversary of Columbia, we've planned an event that focuses on what we learned from the recovery and reconstruction of Columbia regarding crew survivability and how that's been incorporated into the spacecraft under development today. I'd especially like to welcome family members Evelyn Husband-Thompson and her husband Bill, Lonnie McCool and J.P. Harrison with us, and also welcome Jonathan Ward, who's co-author with Mike Leinbach on a new book about the recovery of Columbia, and his wife Jane. More than half of the civil servants working here at JSC today have been hired since we lost Columbia, and also likely the same is true of our contractor community. Challenger happened 15 years after Apollo 1, and Columbia happened 17 years after Challenger. Perhaps we're entering that time frame where the lack of firsthand experience with an accident makes us more vulnerable, either to complacency or just not fully appreciating how actions and decisions affect risk. These considerations make it especially important that we talk about lessons learned. And the hardest of those lessons is how heartbreakingly painful it is to lose a crew. While the STS-107 crew members serve as role models to people around the country and the world, we remember them here very personally as our friends and colleagues and neighbors. To quote then President Bush at his tribute to the Columbia crew at the JSC Memorial 15 years ago, "To leave behind earth and air and gravity is an ancient dream of humanity. For these 7, it was a dream fulfilled. Each of these astronauts had the daring and discipline required of their calling. Each of them knew that great endeavors are inseparable from great risks, and each of them accepted those risks willingly, even joyfully, in the cause of discovery. It's our responsibility to understand and manage those risks and ensure that the overall risk is commensurate to the missions we ask our crews to undertake. Part of doing that well is learning from our past. I'd like to thank a couple of people who do regularly talk about this. Ralph Rowe, now the agency chief engineer, who speaks about Columbia lessons learned frequently, especially to early career people around the agency. And Nigel Packham, who has given many presentations on the Columbia Crew Survivability Report. Today, you'll hear about what led to that report and how we've incorporated it into Orion and commercial crew program vehicles. And now I'd like to invite up Rex Walheim, the Deputy Director of Safety and Mission Assurance.
As you know, tomorrow will mark the 15th year since the Columbia accident. I miss my astronaut classmates and friends that I lost on Columbia, and I think about them often. And I reflect on the great people they were and what I learned from them. Today we're focusing on the valuable lessons we gained from the tragedy and the legacy each one of these pioneers left with our agency and the country. We've learned a great deal from Columbia, and we're committed to real change. Immediately following the completion of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, every employee was issued the report, and the dialogue continues to this day across the agency. The Safety and Mission Success Initiative began an assessment of leadership practices and cultural norms that affect the safety and influence decisions. The governance model was bolstered, providing a template for how technical authority would be implemented to inform decisions. Encouraging dissent is a leadership obligation, and our decision processes resolve dissenting opinions in open forums. We took a hard look at crew survivability and how we can improve future spacecraft designs to endure the most severe environments. In safety and mission assurance, we've made significant efforts towards ensuring mission success and getting our work done safely. We have honed our probabilistic risk assessment skills and capabilities to be among the best in the world at informing risk trades and decisions. We've developed and implemented a Safety and Mission Assurance Technical Excellence Program to provide a comprehensive education necessary to prepare our workforce to meet the demanding technical expectations. And we've defined what a positive safety culture is and are continuing to illuminate methods to enhance it. The key components of the safety culture are that we report our concerns with no fear, we are just and treat each other fairly, we are flexible to meet any challenges that come our way, we learn from our successes and mistakes, and we engage to do our part. I want to welcome our panel speakers, and each of them has a unique perspective on how we rose up following the Columbia to complete the Shuttle program successfully and move on to meet the challenging demands of future programs. Now I'd like to turn it over to Brian Kelly, better known as BK, our Director of Flight Operations.
All right. Thanks very much for all of the introductions. I'm going to dive right into this, and what I'm going to do is introduce our panel of leaders up here, and then we're going to have a great opportunity to share what we know. Let me start out with Wayne Hale to my right here. Wayne began his 32-year career at NASA in flight operations. Started out as a prop systems guy before the first shuttle flight. Well-known flight director for over 15 years. Led over 40 shuttle flight assignments. Joined the shuttle program in 2003, ultimately rising up to be the deputy program manager and then program manager. Serves on a number of space-related advisory boards in addition to being the director of human spaceflight, director of energy for Special Aerospace Services. Let's welcome Wayne Hale. Another longtime friend, Mike Leinbach over here, well-known launch director and noted author. This guy was the shuttle launch director at KSC for the final 11 years of the shuttle program. He led KSC's initial Columbia debris recovery effort in Texas, and thereafter he led the Reconstruction team. He was the driving force behind the Columbia preservation team. And his book, Bringing Columbia Home, tells an inside story of the 25,000-person effort to find Columbia's debris and reconstruct it. Let's hear it from Mike Leinbach. Another guy that grew up in flight operations, Mark Kirasich. He began his career in 1983 at JSC as a member of the Space Shuttle Flight Operations team. Quickly advanced to the position of a lead shuttle payload officer. Selected as a flight director in 1996, supported multiple shuttle missions and ISS expeditions. In 2006, he was selected to be the deputy program manager in Orion, and recently he's been leading our Orion program. Let's hear it from Mark Kirasich. Kathy Leuders. Kathy started out at White Sands, working on OMS pods, working on RCS shuttle systems as a depot manager. She moved over to the space station program. We were there together for quite some time. Many improving and higher level jobs. And recently she became the commercial crew program manager. And actually not recently, it was quite some time ago, and has been leading that effort for quite some time. And as such, she works with the program's commercial providers, Boeing, SpaceX, and also working hard to ensure that human spaceflight to the International Space Station comes home to the United States of America. So let's hear it for Kathy. Colonel Pat Forrester, a man I've known for over a quarter of a century, retired U.S. Army colonel, an aviator, test pilot, and is currently our chief astronaut in the astronaut office. We selected him as an astronaut back in 1996. It's been a while. He's flown 3 shuttle missions, logging over 1,000 hours, or nearly 1,000 hours in space, 4 spacewalks, almost 26 hours of EVA. He's had varying assignments in flight operations, a technical assistant to the director, a Capcom in both our current programs, or shuttle and station, and until recently he was the astronaut office representative to the NASA Engineering and Science Center. And prior to appointing him to his current position, he was the deputy chief of the astronaut office. So let's hear it for Pat. Okay, so starting out, we want to set the tone. Where were you when we lost Columbia? What were you doing? What were these immediate impacts, the personal impacts, and what was that starting point for you? Let's start with Wayne Hale.
So I had just taken a rotational assignment down at the Kennedy Space Center to lead the shuttle program and the launch preparations, working closely with the guy on my right, Mike Leinbach, and the rest of the KSC team. I was with Mike on the morning of February 1st, first in the firing room and then out at the landing site. But the thing that I wanted to talk about after the event happened, and we were so uncertain as to what exactly had happened. We were back in the Launch Control Center trying to watch CNN and other sources, and it was just really hit me that this was a tragic event, but I was hopeful as we had worked with the shuttle launch escape suits and parachutes and all the equipment that we put on after Challenger, and I knew that the shuttle cockpit was pressurized volume, shell inside, another aero shell, the outer mold line of the vehicle. I was very hopeful that some of the things we had practiced for in shuttle crew breakups or shuttle vehicle breakups would come to pass, that the crew would be protected by those double walls, that their suits would inflate and give them oxygen to breathe until they got low enough to pop the side hatch open and use those parachutes and bail out. So I violated all the protocol about an hour, maybe less, after the event, and called the MCC because I still had my flight director phone list cheat sheet, and called the LSO, Marty Lindy, and I said, Marty, have they picked up any of the ELTs, any of the electronic locator transmitters that go off automatically when the chute deploys on every astronaut's backpack? And he said no. And I think that was when I realized that it was really, really bad day. And the rest of the day I was numb, in shock. I can look back on it now. We were all going through the motions. We got the contingency action plan out. We activated the recovery team, which I'm sure Mike will talk a lot more about. And I watched them, went down and watched them load in the aircraft at the shuttle landing facility to go off to East Texas to start the recovery. But I got to tell you, it was like a death in the family. If you've had a family member pass suddenly, then you know. And I was in shock for days. And it took us several days to get through that and just push through and do what we needed to do.
All right, thank you. So Mike, maybe you can set the stage for what we used to do in preparation for shuttle landings, where you were, what the setup was, and what these immediate impacts were from your perspective.
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. Landing day at the Kennedy Space Center and here at Johnson Space Center too is invariably a day of celebration. We were going to welcome our crews back home. The families were there welcoming their loved ones back home. Never expected an accident on landing, frankly. So it was always a day of celebration. I showed up in the Launch Control Center early that morning to watch the deorbit burn, as I always did, and that went fine. Went racing out to the midfield park site at the shuttle landing facility, met up with Wayne and some other folks out there, our administrator and associate administrator, other folks, friends. And we were watching and waiting for Columbia to come home. And when the calls to the crew went unanswered, that was kind of our first cue that something was wrong. The next cue was no sonic booms. The next cue was when we had a countdown clock between us standing there waiting for the landing and the runway itself, maybe 50 yards in front of us, 20 yards in front of us. That ticked down to 0. Columbia should have been right there. We didn't know where Columbia was. It was a surreal feeling, one of complete emptiness. I just remember thinking Columbia is somewhere between orbit and the Kennedy Space Center, and we had no idea where it was. About 3 minutes prior to that, when we didn't hear the booms, I looked at Wayne and I said, well, what do you think? And one word came out of Mr. Hale's mouth, and it was beacons, just like he just described. He was already thinking about how to find them. And so it went from a day of celebration to a day of complete emptiness. Bill Reedy, Associate Administrator, had our contingency plan for spaceflight operations in his hand that Administrator O'Keefe had ordered updated shortly after he took office, just a couple of months earlier, as I recall. And so we got the plan out. It was to name a lead NASA representative for the whole thing. That turned out to be Dave King from the Marshall Space Flight Center. When Columbia was not in front of us, the emptiness, folks, I can't describe it. It is just, we didn't know what to do. We had always been knowing what to do as flight directors, launch directors, crew, program managers. Our positions and yours are ones of knowledge and control. And at that moment, we had neither. So we raced on over to the Launch Control Center, a few folks, and up to my office, and we turned on CNN, and then we first saw the trails. And so we took it from there. We had our first meeting in the Launch Control Center 1 hour after the accident, after which, or some time after which, we learned that the first crew member was being found in Texas. We had no idea. And so the rest of the day is sort of a blur. But we got on that plane that night and came out here and met Dave Whittle from the Mishap Investigation Team at the Barksdale Air Force Base, where he initially set up shop up there, and just tried to scratch together a plan. It was just a day you cannot imagine, and I hope you never do. That's where I was.
All righty. Mark, flight operator, tactical planning, where were you?
Yeah, thanks, BK. I had a little different experience than Wayne and Mike, because at the time I was in flight operations, mission operations we used to call it, but I was on the space station side. And just a couple months earlier in November, we had flown STS-113, the shuttle flight STS-113, which was the flight immediately prior to STS-107. And one of the main objectives of that flight was to deliver the 6th space station crew to the space station. Ken Bowersox, Nikolai Budarn, and Don Pettit. And I happened to be the Expedition 6 lead flight director. So I had a different job, November, December, January, and then coming into the morning of February 1st. And I do recollect, space station operations go on, so we had a busy week the week before. There were, I forget exactly, but we had a number of activities scheduled the following week. So that particular morning, I was taking my time at home, just getting ready, getting up. And we didn't usually have the TV on, but for some reason that morning my wife did. And my wife, Mary, said, "Mark, you better come out here. They're talking about the space shuttle." So I went into our family room just about the time Leroy Kane, who's a close friend of mine, declared the contingency. And I had the same feelings I did share the same feelings that Wayne and Mike described, shock, a feeling of, helplessness. Fog is the word I use a lot. And it took me a while because I sat there. And, but then I had this feeling, I need to do something. And I suddenly recognized a couple things. Well, I didn't know any of the crew members of STS-107 personally. I knew Leroy, I knew the flight control team, I knew the people in the program office. And then I said, "Hey, that's my crew on board." So I got in my car and I went to the control center and to make sure they knew they were okay. And by the time I had gotten to the control center, it was probably 2 hours later. Folks had already talked to them. But in the ensuing days, again, the people in the shuttle program were able to, they had jobs either reconstructing the trajectory, what had happened, or help get out in the fields. We had, in the space station program, we had kind of a different immediate task because you'll recall at the time, in that time frame, we hadn't yet flown the ATV or the HTV. We didn't have the commercial resupply ship, so space station was highly dependent on the space shuttle for resupply, spare components, not only assembly but spare parts, food, clothing, things like that. And many of us knew, wow, probably the shuttle's not going to fly again anytime soon. So what we did with the program and the control team, we said, boy, we better take a stock of where we're at and make sure we can support the crew. And at the time, again, we didn't even have a good plan of how they would come home, what we would do with them. But so we said, it was relatively early in the space station program. We didn't have an accurate accounting of everything on board. How much food, how much clothes. So we had this idea, boy, we better do a survey. And this is where, one of my most poignant memories of being here at NASA since 1983 comes into play. We worked very hard on a survey, a list of questions that we were going to send to the crew, and we were going to send them off looking at all the nooks and crannies of the space station to count things so we would know how long we could keep them on board. And we sent the list up. And again, I was not on console. I was in my office about 2 days later. It was Wednesday morning. And from the control center, I got a phone call. And it was the on-console flight director who said, Mark, you got to come over here. Ken Bowersox wants to talk to you. He's really worried about you, was what he said. And I said, wow. So I hung up the phone. As I'm walking over to the control center, I said, boy, Ken, he's so cool. Here he is, he's up there, he's having a ration food, he's wearing his clothes extra days, we're not sure when he's going to come home, and he's worried about me. But I got to the control center, we set up a private conference, we went upstairs, and Ken and I were talking, and he reiterated, Mark, I'm worried about you. I said, well, Ken, what's the matter? And he goes, well, I have the survey here. And actually, before I go on, let me give one more piece of background. If you know Ken's an ex-Navy pilot, and also Ken is bald. And why that's important, I'll tell you in just a second. And of course, it was a three-person crew. All the crew were men, and that's important because Ken proceeded to read the first question we wrote to the crew, and he goes, Mark, question number 1 is, please go find and count the number of bottles of hand lotion you have on board the space station. And Ken goes, Mark, we're 3 guys. I'm an ex-military guy. How many bottles of hand lotion do you think we need? And I said, oh, yeah, good question, Ken. Why don't we skip question 1, just go on and do the rest of the survey.
Got better, didn't it, Mark?
Oh, yeah. He goes, yes, so let me tell you about question 2. Please go find and count all the bottles of shampoo that are on board the space station. And Ken goes, Mark, do you remember what I look like? So about this time, I was saying, boy, I wish I'd read that note a little bit closer. But actually, it was really good because, we talked about this feeling, and really, I was in this fog. I was in the fog for days. And Ken having that conversation with me really woke me out of it. He was saying, hey, I'm okay. We're okay on board. We're going to be okay. Human spaceflight's going to go on. We're going to work through this. So I really appreciated that phone call with Kevin that day.
All right, thank you. Kathy.
So I also was in the space station program. At the time, I was the acting vehicle manager, and that Saturday, I got a phone call from Scott Gehring, who was the acting vehicle manager. I was acting deputy vehicle manager, and he called me up and said, they're gone. So, at that stage, you're, like everybody's mentioned, you kind of feel like a little bit totally numb inside. But the first thing we had to think about is kind of what Mark was thinking about was, hey, we got a crew on board, and we got to figure this out. And I remember we all went into, we went to 4 South, because it's kind of like you need to be close. You just feel like you need to be close to help. You just want to do something. And it probably kind of contributed to the list that Mark had, but, at the time it was what are our options? We really didn't have a method for certifying cargo on Russian vehicles. We didn't have, you were just starting to pull together plans for, how do we certify food? How do we certify hardware? What do we need? And starting in as probably a method of, in some way, mourning, doing something was a way to kind of make you feel like you were helping. And by looking and helping the crew on orbit, we're helping the crew that we lost, right? And so in the station program I did, it was our way, I think, of of mourning and hopefully helping our fellow program folks over on the shuttle side. The second thing that really struck me was, and those who work here at JSC, every day when you drive by the Johnson Space Center sign, you saw how much the community loved NASA, the crew members. You just would see all those flowers and balloons and things showing up. And it really, really struck you. You know, every day we do work that means something to us. But it really showed me that every day we do work that means something to our community and to the country. And also to, you found out, to the whole, Earth. And it really, really struck me. And so, we carried on because of that, because we knew that what we were doing was important, not only for ourselves, but for the nation and for our humankind. So it was that seeing those mementos really meant a lot to me.
Thanks, Kathy. Pat, so where were you? How did it hit you? How was the comm?
Yeah, I remember it very well. Saturday morning, beautiful weather. Those of us in the astronaut office, we're a family, and yet we're all living our lives. And my wife and I and our youngest son were headed to Austin for a college visit at UT with 2 other families. And that day we piled into 2 cars. All the men got in one car with our sons, and the women, and I think there was one daughter with them, headed to Austin. And we were driving along probably halfway between here and Austin, and my cell phone rang, and it was my wife, and she said, "Hey, do you guys have the radio on?" I said, "No, we're just up here talking." And she said, you turn the radio on. So as soon as we did, of course, all the channels were carrying the story of something was going on with Columbia, and it was not good. So we pulled off the side of the road. I realized the right thing for me to do was to head home. My wife wanted to come home with me, so we got in our car, which was one of the cars, and everybody else crammed in the other car. We handed our son off to these other families, and off they went for the college visit, and we headed home. At the time I was assigned to a mission, I was on STS-117, so you heard Mark say the most recent mission that launched was 113, so we were really just a few months away from launch ourselves. And so as we headed back, I was trying to figure out what I needed to do. I was probably in a little bit of a fog, so I'm not sure who I called first. It was probably my commander. And the word was, get in a flight suit and get out to Ellington. We're not quite sure what we're going to do, but that's where we'll be. And so we got home, dropped my wife off, got a flight suit on, got out to Ellington, and there were several people out there, and we were beginning to really get the details of what was happening. I don't remember how long we were there, but I do remember that toward the end of the time, they had announced upstairs that the families were on their way back, and I remember actually being out at Ellington when the plane landed, and that was just kind of surreal to me. I had been a family escort. I could picture just that event from being out on the runway all the way to coming back with the families. Over the next couple weeks, it was hard for me personally because we were on a crew, and the word we were getting is, we don't know what happened. It could be something that is determined quickly, and we need you to be ready to fly. Obviously, that was not the case, but they asked about 3 or 4 crews to continue with their training. So, day after day, week after week, we were focusing on our mission in the back of our minds, not thinking that we were really going to fly it, seeing our office mates headed out to the field to help with recovery and other things, and that was, I just remember it was a dilemma for me to continue to train as if we were going to fly. But that's what we did. Eventually, our crew kind of picked up the duties of doing the memorial flybys. We did them at the Naval Academy, we did them up at Amarillo, at KSC, and each time we would do that, it would just bring things back, focus back on what it was we were doing.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Now the panel's going to kind of shift a teeny bit. Now we're going to go into what did we learn, the lessons learned, how do we influence these programs going forward. Let me start out with Wayne. Wayne, you had major leadership roles after the accident, made the crucial decision to move forward with a crew survivability report, variety of lessons learned. What went into that decision? How did you consider the timing of when to do it and how long it would take? What did you learn that we need to carry forward into these new development programs? Very broad.
Well, I may take more than 3 minutes.
That's okay. I'll give you a little time.
So one of the things when I was in Florida after the accident doing my job down there, kind of an administrative job. We had a full day's worth of work in the office. We were supporting the CABE. We were doing all this stuff, all the bureaucratic work that it takes to keep things going. But every evening after work was done around 5 o'clock, second shift, I'd go out to the Reconstruction hangar and see what parts had been shipped back, what evidence had been found, talk to some of the engineers about what the theories were, because for a long time we didn't know what happened. I mean, we knew what happened, but we didn't know why it happened. So they were out there looking at debris, and it's really spooky to see this parts of the spaceship, things that we talked about in mission control and operated, and talked about, maintenance at the Cape and maybe upgrades, this, that, and the other, and here were all these parts, burned up, caked with mud, parts. And it was very solemn to walk around that Reconstruction. Your second shift was quiet because most people were on first shift. They had a kind of a skeleton crew on second. Trying to sort pieces. But over in one corner, they had a room. They'd constructed a room, and that room was where the cabin, crew cabin contents were, and it was jealously guarded. It was felt, we have to be respectful. We don't want sensationalism. We don't want, you can imagine. So it was guarded, and Pam Milroy, bless her heart, was in charge of that room, and getting past Pam, who's about this tall, you didn't get past.
Wasn't easy.
I mean, here I was, I'm the lead program guy, Space Shuttle program in Florida, and she wouldn't let me in the door. So we had a long conversation about that, and we finally got in, and if anything, it was worse inside the room. Because now it was the personal objects, it was the seats, it was the suits, it was the checklists, it was all those things that we knew the crew had worked with, and it was bad, and that stayed with me. So, 1st of July, Bill Parsons, who was the new program, in case you didn't notice, the whole shuttle program management team was changed out. I mean, you can call it what you want to, but they were all changed out. Everybody who had been in a position of decision-making before Columbia was moved aside, moved to different jobs, and they brought in a whole new team. And Bill Parsons was named the program manager, and Bill called me and asked me to come back to Houston to be his number 2. And we were supporting the Columbia accident investigation, and something we got to talk about, by the way, is schedule pressure. We'll come around to that. The CABE was going to complete their report late summer, put their report out about the 1st of September, and people from certain quarters of NASA headquarters were saying, you guys can fly in October, right? Well, no. And they were not happy with that story, but we faced a lot of interesting pressure. But one of the things that happened a couple of months after I got back to Houston was we had the medical folks come. They had a number of medical doctors who had done the forensics, who had done the autopsies, who had done all that forensic work. They were not NASA flight surgeons. They were aeromedical flight surgeons, and they had done that work, and they had their report. I don't know, any guys like to watch some of these crime shows where they always go down to the morgue and they have, the the medical examiner and his da-da-da-da-da. And I don't particularly like those, but it's not real. You know, it's fake, it's somebody made up, somebody you don't know. Well, they came to town and they had a 4-hour briefing. And I got to sit through 4 hours of detailed discussion medically what happened. And I don't sleep well at night sometimes because of that. And I will not share that with you. It's horrific. But it was mostly a problem because they're people I knew. You know, it's one thing to watch some show or talk about somebody you don't know, but when it's your colleagues, when it's people you know, wow, that's really tough. And the thing that came out was, you know, there were 5, I think, fatal situations. In other words, multiple things. And I won't go into that, but I really, after that, Bill Parsons and I had the crew escape people come talk to us about all the studies that they had done for options to put, you know, you put crew pods in, ejection seat, you name it. They had studied every option on what might be done to help a shuttle crew get out of an accident. And we noticed one thing: they were centered on the launch phase, because we always considered the launch phase the most dangerous phase, but the energy is different. It's a different situation. And kind of about 3/4 of the way through the briefing, we kind of woke up and we said to the guys, well, what would have made a difference for the Columbia crew? And they said, nothing. We don't have anything. The energy was 4 times greater than what you have during the same altitude phase of launch, and there's nothing that we can figure out that you could do differently to save this vehicle, save the people in this vehicle. So, you know, there you are. I told you it was going to take more than 3 minutes.
It's okay.
Another few weeks went by, and there was an appointment on my calendar. Pam Milroy and Nigel Packham wanted to see me about something called a crew survivability report, which was a term I had never heard of or talked about before. And they came to see me and they said, look, we have all this information that we've learned about how the safety devices failed, about the things that were not good, the helmets, and, you know, just a whole raft of things that we learned that didn't work as well as we thought they were going to work, and certainly didn't work in this situation. And we think it's important we document. Oh, I forgot to tell you one other part of that. When the doctors were going through this awful 4-hour detailed, I'm not a medical person, I don't like medical stuff anyway, they said, oh, by the way, we wanted to find out how this related to the Challenger accident and the Challenger results, and we couldn't find them. We couldn't get access to them. They were hidden away, and over time, the equivalent records, I don't know whether they were lost or there's hidden in some archive somewhere, but the docs couldn't find them. They couldn't reference them. And that struck a nerve. So when Pam and Nigel came to me and said, we've got this report, but a lot of people don't think we ought to publish this. It's sensitive, you know, HIPAA and sensitivity for the crew families, and it's just bad, kind of looks bad for NASA. We really don't think we ought to publish this. And they said, we think, Pam and Nigel, think it's very important to publish this. And there were a whole community of the flight surgeons in agreement with that. And I said, write it up. We'll write you a check for the funding, because there's always money involved to get this done. I think it's important. Let's try to make it, you know, we got to abide by the HIPAA rules, and et cetera, but we want to get the story out. So they spent several months, I think, putting the story together, went through several iterations, got a lot of criticism. A lot of people thought we shouldn't put it out. But after we went through after I'd been through, and I talked to Bill Parsons, he felt the same way. After what we had been through, it was like, well, they can fire me if they want to. This is important. We're going to do it anyway. Just like we're not going to launch in October. They can fire us if we want because it's not right. We're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. So we got the report. They did an admirable job. And when I got the report, I said, we are going to send this report out. So we got in the media and we looked at every organization that was talking about space tourism, launching people, doing, crackerjack things maybe in space, and serious people too. And I said, we want to send a copy of this to the CEO or chief of every one of these organizations. And I think we sent out about 30 copies with a handwritten note to every one of them, said, here's what we learned. Please take what we've learned and design your spacecraft better. And frankly, several of those folks wrote us back and said, thank you. We really appreciate this. This was very important. We found it very useful. But we did it in opposition. There was always opposition. And sometimes you just have to do what's right, even though, well, I love Bill Parsons. His favorite phrase, I don't know if you know Bill very well, he was a Marine Corps captain in the infantry.
We won't use all of Bill's
and I'll
phrases.
but his thing was, what's the worst they can do to us? Shave our heads and send us to Okinawa? Which is what they did to him in the Marine Corps. So what's the worst they can do to it? So we did it anyway. And I think the report's very good. After a number of years, the medical community got together and published it in a book form. It's out there. And it's basically the crew survivability report, a little skinnier for the medical community, LOS, name of the book. And you can probably find it on Amazon or something. So, I think it was very important. I know these guys have all read it and they've taken it to heart. And we want to make the next spacecraft safer. We want to do better by our crews.